Despite the difficulties that have been presented on locating Book of Mormon DNA, there have been many new discoveries linking the Americas to the Middle East, therefore supporting the Book of Mormon.
There was a recent study that was published in the academic journal PLOS Genetics, I think, just a couple of years ago that actually it's one of the most comprehensive surveys of genetic variation, nuclear genetic variation across the world. And when you look at the data from North and South America, it's clear that the majority of those populations have mixed Asian European ancestry. Although there is an interesting bit of data that probably only an LDS scientist would pick up, which shows for the Mayan people and maybe one or two other cultures close geographically to the Yucatan area, there's actually a nice infusion of Middle Eastern, what they call Middle Eastern genotypes in those populations.
And then we have what's called human lymphocyte antigens. An antigen is part of the immune system. It fights off infections, and there are different antigens for different diseases. Let's take an example. Take you back into the 14th century, and you're living in a town, and half the people have died of the Black Plague. Those people, unless their children survive them, their DNA is gone. And so the ones who survive a plague like that are the ones who have the antigen that will fight it off. And so you can compare various peoples to see which antigens they have. And these are inherited genetically. We know that it's from the nuclear DNA that determines which antigens your body produces. So some people will have a certain set of antigens, some will have other sets of antigens. And from those you can get some idea of where their ancestors were from because of the types of antigens found in other areas as well. For example, James Guthrie noted that there are 18 non-Indian alleles that in fact are found in the genes.
An allele refers to nuclear DNA. So at fusion, when you're just really barely in your mom's womb, any one of us gets a copy of DNA from mom, a copy of DNA from dad. So you actually have two copies of the same gene, and those are known as alleles, those separate copies.
18 of these alleles that produce the antigens are found in Native Americans, but are not exclusively in Native Americans. They have some that are exclusive to them, but the 18 are not exclusive to them. Of those, half, 9, originated among Afro-Asiatic peoples. Half of the non-native antigens found among Native Americans are from the Middle East, from those very people. These 9 alleles that they share with other peoples in the world, 47% of the total of the non-Native American antigens, that is to say things that didn't start in America but were brought here from elsewhere, 47% of them are actually from that Middle East area.
The Y-chromosome is a particular piece of DNA that's inherited by all males that actually makes them male. So, for example, males would have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Females would have 2 X's.
The Y chromosome studies are less common throughout the world, and especially in terms of Native Americans. A lot more studies on mitochondrial or female line DNA have been done than on the Y chromosome. What's interesting, though, is that the Y chromosome studies are more supportive of a Middle Eastern origin for Native Americans.
Mitochondrial DNA is a very small molecule of DNA. It's made up of the genetic alphabet. There are 4 letters, G's, A's, T's, and C's. And when you compare the mitochondrial genome to the nuclear genome, it's very modest. The mitochondrial genome will have on the order of 17,000 pieces of information, whereas the nuclear genome will have on the order of 6 or 7 billion pieces of information.
36% of Native Americans have the Y chromosome labeled 1C, while 31% of Near Eastern Jews have it.
My personal view, my scientific opinion, linguistics, so on and so forth, and some of the cultural themes found in the Book of Mormon that are consistent with ancient Near Eastern populations. I think that's solid enough. And plus you add to that the spiritual conviction that the Book of Mormon is true if you've really read it and prayed about it and done all the things that a person who is sincerely interested in finding out whether or not that was an ancient record revealed to a boy prophet by God, I'm completely convinced in the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I have no reservations about it.
In the second verse of the Book of Mormon, Nephi states that he makes his record in the language of his father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. Both Hebrew and Egyptian are mentioned again at the end as Mormon and Moroni attempt to complete the Book of Mormon record. And then in Mosiah, we learn that Lehi, having been taught in the language of the Egyptians, could read the engravings on the brass plates.
There is linguistic evidence that ties Mesoamerica to the Near East as well. Back in the 1960s, Pierre Agrinier, a French linguist who worked with Maurice Swadesh, who was one of the great fathers of linguistics, actually compared the Sawiza language family of southern Mexico with the Hebrew language. And he determined, what he used was the list of 200 words that Swadesh had prepared. Swadesh believed that these were the 200 words that changed more slowly in languages as they separated from their sister language. The list of 200 includes things like fire, ashes, mother, food as a generic term. And Agrinier determined that of those terms in Sawiza languages, 5% of them corresponded in both sound and in meaning. That is to say, both in lexical meaning as well as in the phonetics. They would correspond to Hebrew, 5%. A friend of mine, Robert F. Smith, who has done a lot of Semitic studies and in fact studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and did a lot of Egyptian while he was there and even before that, he looked at the same list and compared it not with Hebrew as Agrinier had done. He compared it with with the Egyptian terms, and he found that 13% of the Sawiza words on the list corresponded to Egyptian. They were cognates. Brian Stubbs, who is a Latter-day Saint and is an expert in the Uto-Aztecan languages, has been comparing them not just with Hebrew, but with languages cognate to Hebrew, such as Arabic. And he has concluded that there are a lot of remnants of the Hebrew language that one can find in the Uto-Aztecan language.
As a linguist, I have found considerable evidence of Hebrew and Egyptian in at least one language family, Uto-Aztecan. I have not yet published my findings for the linguistic community. The Uto-Aztecan language family is a language, about 30 related languages that are descended from what linguists call Proto-Uto-Aztecan. Their geographic location ranges from Idaho in the north to Mexico City in the south, basically. There are a few dialects in other places. About half of them are in the southwest United States, the other half are in Mexico. Actually, what I find in Uto-Aztecan is two different dialects of Northwest Semitic and quite a bit of Egyptian that has the same sound correspondences as one of those dialects of Northwest Semitic. Northwest Semitic is the branch of Semitic that Hebrew comes out of, Hebrew and Phoenician and so forth. Now that's extremely interesting because that's exactly what the Nephite merger would be, is this merger of two different dialects of Northwest Semitic, one of them having a significant amount of Egyptian in them. And so it's extremely consistent, in fact so consistent that the probability of that happening by chance would be very low. Another thing we need to keep in mind about the Mulekites is that we don't know how they got here, except they obviously crossed the ocean somehow, but the Phoenicians were the prominent seafaring people of that time near Palestine. And in fact, the fact that the people of Mulek named their main waterway the river Sidon, well, Sidon is a major port city of the Phoenicians.
We do have archaeological evidence that Mesoamerican peoples actually did move north and settled in the American Southwest, mostly in the area of Arizona, New Mexico. Chaco Canyon, for example, in New Mexico, there's evidence of two different cultures living there side by side. And one of these is very close to what we find in Mesoamerica. They build the same kind of structures, they use the same kind of pottery, and so on. The Book of Mormon also talks about the two remaining sons of the first Helaman, who actually left and went to the North Country. We have others going to the north. We have the Gadianton robbers at one point going to the north.
First of all, it might be good to know that Uto-Aztecan is not really all that far from the Mayan area. In fact, some dialects, Aztecan dialects, are actually south of Mayan areas. Some Pipil is located in various places around the Mayan area. In fact, most Uto-Aztecan languages are located in what most LDS archaeologists would consider to be the Nephite land northward. In other words, in Mexico and then perhaps further north of that in the United States. DNA and language don't always match. In fact, it might be that they match less than half the time. For example, everybody in Europe has Roman DNA, also has Celtic DNA, also has Germanic DNA. Even though those were three separate people, they've mixed enough being in the same area that geneticists cannot isolate Celtic DNA, for example, nor Germanic DNA. There's simply this European DNA that's a mixture of everything. And so peoples in the Americas could well be descended from Book of Mormon peoples, even though they are not speaking languages descended from Hebrew or Egyptian.